Welcome back. This is going to be the last lecture in section 5, all about vocabulary. And having looked at specific language for each of the different question types, in this lecture we're going to look at paraphrasing in general the task language. So avoiding the repetition of task language categories and units of measurements which are common in task 1. So let's think about categories first of all. Categories in task 1 questions are very variable. So this section will cover just a couple of the most common category themes. But I want to stress right now that this selection of categories is limited. It's only going to be 4. It's countries and nationalities, activities, foods, and transport. So I'm going to stress right now that if you would like me to cover another category and if you'd like to ask for ways to paraphrase those particular categories, do get in touch on the Q&A section, and I will try to develop this lecture in the future or perhaps add a PDF document. But for now, we're just going to focus on these 4 category themes and how we can paraphrase common expressions. So let's begin by looking at countries and nationalities. Very simply, we're going to go through one example and look at how we can paraphrase it. So the example here is Spain. Imagine we're looking at the category of Spain. Let's say the graph is people in Spain versus people in another country, how many apples that they buy per year. So we could say Spain. So we could say Spain buys on average 1,200 apples. Or we could use the Spanish. We could start looking at it in terms of people. So the Spanish. We could also use Spanish citizens, Spanish government, Spanish workers, so using an adjective and also using a noun next to it. We could say citizens of Spain, so we could use a noun phrase there. So just flipping around the order. Finally, we could use Spaniards, Germans, Italians, Thais, things like this. So we can use any of those forms. You shouldn't have to repeat the same expressions over and over. What about activities? We'll look at an example of a particular activity, chatting online. So of course we could say chatting online, use the same form, but we might be able to flip the words around and say online chat. This works here. It might not work in all examples. For example, you would say playing football, you wouldn't say football play, because play in this case would not collocate with football in that way. So do be careful here. But here we can say online chat. We could say chatting on the internet. Think about how you could paraphrase online. You could paraphrase it to on the internet. You could say chatting via social media. That's usually what we do when we chat online. And messaging online. Chatting, messaging. Think about changing the verb. What's another form of the verb that we could use that doesn't change the meaning but just offers a bit of variety? Let's look at a couple more. First of all, looking at foods. And we're going to look here, chicken consumption. Chicken consumption. So of course, as always, we can use chicken consumption. That's where we're going to start. How else could we paraphrase this? We could say the consumption of chicken. So we're swapping the words around, the 2 nouns around. So instead of a compound noun, we've now got a noun phrase, the noun of noun. We could say the amount of chicken consumed. Maybe that looks a little bit similar to the introductions that we looked at earlier in this course. And that's because it is similar. They can help us. Those introductions can help us here. We could say consumption levels for chicken. And we could say the quantity of chicken eaten. 2 words being changed here. Quantity. Instead of amount, we're saying quantity. Instead of consumed, we're saying eaten. So of course we could also say the quantity of chicken consumed and the amount of chicken eaten. Also okay. Okay, so plenty of options here. And you may be able to do this for things which are not related to foods, maybe items. Imagine mobile phones. So mobile phone purchases, the purchases of mobile phones, the number of mobile phones purchased, purchase numbers for mobile phones, the quantity of mobile phones purchased. So it's not just foods, this could come into any kind of item most of the time. Finally, let's have a look at transport. The example we're going to look at is travelling by train, and of course by train is what we're going to start with. How else could we say about the number of people who travel by train? We could say the number of people who use train as a mode of transport. So use train, take the train as a mode of transport, etc. We could say by rail. In this case, train, we can paraphrase to rail. We're not changing the other words, we're just changing train here to rail. We could say via train. So instead of changing the word train, we change the word by to via. And we could say take the train as well. So these are just 4 categories that we've looked at here. As I mentioned earlier, do get in touch if you want to, if you would like me to explore some more. For now, we're going to look at paraphrasing times. We're paraphrasing times now. Let's have a look at this, this chart again here, this graph with a trend. And let's have a look at this example. After 2006, the number of basketball students plummeted to just 20. Another way of saying that is between 2006 and 2007, the number of basketball students plummeted to just 20. So instead of saying after, you're using between and. You could also say by 2008, the number of basketball students had plummeted to just 20. Here we're using by, but notice that when we use by, we need to use the past perfect. So we have had plummeted. In a 2-year period, from 2006 to 2008, the number of basketball students plummeted to just 20. Again, another form of paraphrasing, we can use a noun like period. In a 2-year period. And pre-2006, basketball numbers ranged from 56 to 61, but post-2006, the number of basketball students plummeted to just 20. Again, the same information is being conveyed here, but we're using pre and post to talk about before and after a particular time. So 5 different ways of saying the same thing. Finally, let's have a look at paraphrasing units of measurement. Now, there are a number of ways that we can paraphrase units of measurement regardless of what those units are. So let's have a look at a common unit of measurement. Comes up quite a lot. Numbers of people. Here's the first example. In 2012, 64,000 people visited Sweden, while 25,000 people visited Norway. How can we say that in another way? Well, we can use the word people again. So in 2012, 64,000 people visited Sweden, while the figure for Norway was 25,000. Okay, so instead of using this 25,000 people visited Norway, we can say the figure for Norway was 25,000. And there are lots of ways that we can paraphrase this in a very similar format. Same here, 64,000 people visited Sweden, while the count for Norway was 25,000. While the number for Norway was 25,000. While the data for Norway was 25,000. While 25,000 was the figure for Norway. And notice you can repeat this final structure with the above words. While 25,000 was the number for Norway, while 25,000 was the count for Norway, while 25,000 was the data for Norway. Okay, so lots of different ways of paraphrasing here. So this is just looking at numbers of people, but this language is so flexible that we can use it for pretty much any unit of measurement. So let's have a look at a different one. 64,000 tons were transported by rail, while the figure for air was 25,000. When we say air, we're talking about going by plane. Tons of whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. It could be tons of apples, tons of oil, tons of gold, who knows. So 64,000 tons were transported by rail, while the figure for air, the count for air, the number for air, the data for air, 25,000 was the figure for air. All of these also work. It's a very flexible way of paraphrasing language. Hopefully that gives you a little bit more flexibility with the language. Go ahead and try and use this paraphrasing technique in your next response. And if you have any questions about it, as always, do get in touch. And if you'd like me to cover any more topics or categories in a future lecture, as always, as I mentioned earlier, do get in touch with the Q&A function, and I'd be happy to hear from you. So that wraps up section 5. In the next lecture, we're going to be moving on to section 6, which is all about the band descriptor category, grammatical range and accuracy. So I'll see you there.